This is Steve in Dallas, Texas. It's Saturday morning, and you, my friend, are listening to Light Talk.
And good morning from me. This is Stan in Gainesville, Florida. And today we are discussing teaching design and technology, retiring cable, and how many light cues should I write? All on Light Talk.
And this is David coming to you from the beautiful Belmont Shore neighborhood of Long Beach, California. And if you don't already know, you are listening to Light Talk, and we are the Lumen Brothers.
When are you going to let me sing? I never get to sing.
Oh, you shouldn't be singing. All right.
You're right. I shouldn't be singing.
None of us should be singing, actually. Well, welcome, everyone, to episode 170. And before we get started, we have a very special surprise announcement about next week's show. Our friends Driscoll Otto and fellow Luminoid bandmate Zach Bovray will be with us for the entire show. Should be a blast. What do you guys think of that? Should be fun, right?
I think it's social activity, which I'm craving.
So, let's get started. Hey, guess what? From our Light Talk Central mailbox. This week, we received the following letter from one of our listeners. And I would say it's a little terse. Wouldn't you guys think this letter is terse?
Yeah, I read that. We need to get it. We don't have it, I think.
What do you mean we don't have it? The letter?
We don't get it. No, we don't get it.
Oh, we don't understand it?
Well,
okay,
yeah.
Well, anyway.
I think it's pretty clear from the very first word he uses.
It's clear to me, too. So, Luther Pope from Charlotte, North Carolina writes, "Idiots. I have so many complaints about so many of your shows, but last week's show takes the cake. I was listening to your comments about sea otter farts. First, everyone knows that sea otters do not have the smelliest farts in the animal kingdom. Sea lions do. Anyone who has ventured within a mile of sea lions knows this, and mating season is the most pungent time for sea lions. Apparently, the scientists believe that it has something to do with nature's way of combining mating and the uncontrollable release of smelly internal air. Happens to me and the wife all the time. Next, we have that old stoner, David."
That's you, David.
Apparently so. Like I was saying, we have that old stoner, David, trying to explain the difference between additive and subtractive color mixing. Did that guy go to school? He states that subtractive color mixing is when you filter out the wavelengths of light in a gel. Moron. That's color filtering, not mixing. Finally, I suggest that you change your crappy theme song. I don't care who is playing on it. I only care if it's danceable. And my wife and I can't dance to it. I am giving you 3 hacks one more week. If I don't hear immediate changes, I will take my listening elsewhere. Stay safe and wear a mask. Luther. So, Luther, thank you for your comments and suggestions. Regarding the danceability of the theme song, I have not yet had the time to remix it into a disco version, so stay tuned.
Luther has a point here. I called my contact at Greenpeace, and they said, and I quote, "I don't think there's really any other odor on the planet that could do a sea lion justice. And I don't think one can describe the odor to a citizen who's never experienced it." So, I mean, that's a big, bold statement. But just to kind of put it in perspective, I also got number 2, 3, and 4 in the flagellant category. Coming in at number 2 is the Bolson pupfish. And it's a little fish that lives in Mexico. And if they don't fart regularly, the gas just builds up inside their system and they explode. So my favorite was number 3. And she said, "Cheetahs may be the fastest land animal, but they can't outrun their own flagellant. It's why they make that face when they're in a group." And finally, number 4, my personal favorite, elephants. Elephant farts are so bad that their caretakers feed them a special fart-reducing diet.
Very interesting. Now, I want to get back to this fish. My question is, does this fish expel its gas underwater?
It actually comes to the surface to expel its gas. And that's odd for a fish. Normally, a fish doesn't have a flagellant. Fish and birds are pretty much excluded from the flagellant category, as are insects.
Well, it kind of makes sense because the fish needs to come up from the deep and expel its gas. It's a matter of buoyancy because it's expelling air, obviously, which will actually make it less buoyant and it will be able to sink down into the ocean again.
Or it'll just explode if it doesn't come out.
Well, all that being said, Steve has our first listener question.
I have an anonymous first-year teacher writes, do you teach design and technology as separate classes, or do you combine them into one class? Well, I think we live in a brave new world of technology. The Grand MA, the Geo, the Hog, the Neo, those aren't your grandmother's consoles, that we're using anymore. There's this misconception that technology and design don't go hand in hand. It's like if I'm teaching technology, then maybe I'm missing out on some things I should be teaching in design class. But I don't think that there's anybody who is going to be concerned if they're teaching the difference between a Leica and a Fresnel in a design class. That's a type of technology. We need to understand the tools we work with. If I'm teaching programming to my first-year designers, to me, that makes good sense. The class isn't going to be as involved if it were being taught to someone who simply wants to be a programmer. So there's a couple different levels of technology class that easily can move into a design class. If you think about costume design, it's nice if a costume designer understands draping, but they don't have to be a draper to be a good costume designer. So all of these are just ways to share information and to push the student forward and help them make a decision.
There was this debate going on in my life about this question about design and technology, and sort of sometimes some designers sort of held up their nose to technology and, I don't teach that stuff. I don't have to understand that stuff and blah, blah, blah. And I didn't know. I've always been a tinkerer. I like technology, but I like art as well. So I remember taking my first trip to Italy, and I was struck by these Renaissance artists who had discovered all these they had rediscovered sort of the old Greek formulas and mathematics and the technology involved, and then were rediscovering it in the Age of Enlightenment. And they made fantastic art, but it was all because they had kind of stumbled back upon these technological concepts and ideas. So I think that, the separation between the two is artificial, and I actually don't think it's productive. I do think you can teach both in your classes. Sometimes that's a practical matter. For me, I don't really have a lighting technologist per se to teach, so I sort of have to do both. Now, would I love it if my students were taking deeper levels of technology with another person that was their passion, and then they came to me and we just talked about art? That'd be great. I don't have that, so I have to walk both. So I know enough technology to be dangerous, and we get to that point where then we can really sort of use it artistically. So I don't think it's an either or, and I think it's a false kind of argument, but I think it's both. And that's where I kind of agree with Steve. How much you emphasize one or the other depends on your expertise. So, but would I like to have a separate class in programming? Yeah, I sure would. I could see, there's so much more technology to manage these days, and a good craftsman or a good artist knows their tools, and the better you know those tools, the better you can use them.
Well, I'm going to disagree with both of you, and I think there's no right or wrong here, or as Steve always says, there are no, and what do you say? There are no enemies,
no villains here.
There are no villains here,
I like
right?
That too.
Exactly. I think it has to do with teaching style and how we all teach our students, and it's different. Everyone's different. I believe that art is art. And sometimes we talk about the tools of the art when it comes into the discussion of the current art that we're talking about. But the way I work is I like to get the students into a sort of artistic frame of mind and allow their creativity to just release. And I think if you're thinking specifically, well, what would work to do that right now? I think a Neo would be a much better board to create this cue sequence than a Hog or whatever. I don't like going into that because then it gets really, really technical. And I think then it gets into this sort of box. and restricts their creative freedom. But again, that's just the way I teach. I like to have separate classes for the technology.
I wish I could have it.
Well, you could. You just have a separate design class and a separate technical class.
But I'd have to teach them both.
I'm fortunate we have 2 lighting teachers where I'm at. So, I can teach just the strictly artistic stuff, and Martha can teach the technical stuff, and she loves the technical stuff.
Right. Like you say, I have a lot of that learning happens in the lab under my electrician, but I would have to become a much more robust technologist to teach a class in technology or programming.
Anyway, Ted from Utah writes, do you think that lighting design is prescriptive, responsive, informative, or emotive? Please do not cop out and say all 4. My teacher says good lighting is basically responsive. I'm going to cop out. I say all 4. Now, seriously, if I was going to choose one, and again, this gets back to our previous question. I think it's different for everybody. So there's no right or wrong answer here. And I would say for me, it's emotive. It's a means of expressing emotions, which is why I always love expressionism, because it really is pure emotion. It's about exactly what that moment is about and what we feel in the moment. And, to be quite frank, that's how I teach design. Because music is emotive. But again, prescriptive, I don't know what that means.
I don't even know what prescriptive means exactly.
Responsive, that means you're responding to an idea, I guess so, in a way. Informative, it's always informative, whether it's those the other 3 or not. Although emotive is going to hit right at the basic emotion of the moment. And I think, Stan, you and I were talking the other day about some political thing, and you said something like, well, the real key to voting or to voting for a candidate is an emotional response from the voter.
I think at the end of the day, most, not all, but many people will. I think I agree with you, David, about emotive. If Ted is forcing me to pick one,
he's forcing you.
Yeah. Okay. So I actually, emotive is the final determinant for me of the choice. Prescriptive, I think, means sort of there's a methodology that you must follow. I don't think it's a prescriptive art form, and I don't think it should be. There are some methods that you should learn, but I don't think it's prescriptive. Responsive, I think responsive/reactive. I think it is a bit of a reactive art, is that you respond to what you see, what you're feeling. And informative is there in the sense that, in a technical sense, that the audience gets the information about the action on the stage on waves of light and waves of sound. That's how it's delivered to your organism, to your eyes, to your ears. So the information that you take in is colored, if you will, or shaped by the light. And so that information, you could get the same information on a stage with work light, and there'd be a whole different set of information on a stage that's really beautifully designed. So there is an informative aspect to it, but ultimately the decision maker, I think, it's why I agree with you, that what your emotive feeling is in responding to the work is going to influence the choices that you make as an artist.
Well, prescriptive would be telling the people what they should do or what they should think, rather than giving them suggestions.
You meaning the audience or the designers?
The audience.
The audience, yeah.
You're leading them in a very specific way.
Yeah.
Interesting. Which we do sometimes, intentionally.
Yeah, sometimes intentionally, sure. You want to make a statement. Tom in Georgia writes, at your school, is there a system by which you retire SO cable? At what point does the cable begin to fail? I ask because we have cable that is easily 20 years old and still in use. I suspect that the power coming into my house is coming in on a cable that's 20 years old. And actually, I can tell you for sure, the cable in my walls is 20 years old and it's still working. So I think there's a couple of things to think about. It depends upon abuse. We probably would not retire cable unless the jacket was really cracking or was abused. We certainly will cut off the ends and make sure we have a good strain relief and maybe rewire connectors and that kind of thing. But copper is going to last a long time, particularly if it's flexible cable, which is what we use in the theater most of the time, as opposed to solid core stuff. So I think if it's behaving fine and you don't see any issues with it, or it's not rotting out somehow, I think it can last quite a while. But I will say this: we do inspect cable, and if something is looking bad or causing a short, we will put a tag on it, and it will get repaired. If cable gets abused, stuff rolls over it, or it gets sticky in some way. There's reasons why it could become undesirable. But
well, certainly if you're at SeaWorld and there's a sea lion in the cable, it might be undesirable.
That's a good example. And I remember some of my old friend John Reed from Verilight would talk about having to coil up, feeder cable after rock shows, after it was covered in, human vomit and stuff like that. And it was like, okay, maybe there's a point at which that cable, if it's holding the odor, it might want to go away.
Vomit-soaked cable.
Vomit-soaked cable.
That sounds wonderful.
He actually said that. He said, I got tired of doing that kind of stuff,
That's when you know you've made it in a road crew, is when you no longer have to roll up the vomit-soaked cable.
Right.
Wow.
Philip in New Jersey writes, so I believe that Edison made lamps for stage lights. Did Nikola Tesla dapple in theatrical lighting too? All right. So Thomas Edison, got his little light bulb going in 1879. And I was surprised to find that light bulb was enhanced in Germany by Werner von Siemens. And so Werner von Siemens, of course, is the fellow who lays the groundwork for Sylvania lamps. So I guess through the back door, Thomas Edison had something to do with stage lights in that way. You might be thinking of Nikola Tesla and his interaction with the Westinghouse Electric Corporation. He was involved in that company for some years, and certainly Westinghouse eventually bought CBS, and then they were bought by Viacom. Some people, I've never seen it. There are people who say they have seen a Westinghouse Fresnel. Now, the very first Fresnel lens was built back in 1823. And the idea behind that was that Fresnel lens would go into lighthouses. So Westinghouse Fresnel, I'm not saying there wasn't a Westinghouse Fresnel, and I did find some information online that suggested the person who saw it said it had Altman parts stuck on it. Well, Altman didn't come along until 1953, but that doesn't mean that they weren't building parts that would retrofit earlier fixtures. So a Westinghouse Fresnel, Tesla, was involved with Westinghouse on 2 occasions building lighthouses. And they were working with their good friend Krauss-Heinz. Also, the Krauss-Heinz dimming system is coming along at this time. But if you think about this period in time, Kliegel, 1896, is when they opened their doors. Strand, 1914. Bardwell McAllister, 1926. Moll, 1927. As I say, Altman came along in 1953. I don't know if I can't find any information that definitively says that he was involved in stage lighting. Maybe one of our listeners can chime in on this. Maybe someone's got a photograph of the Westinghouse Fresnel. Tesla died in 1943, so if there's a Westinghouse Fresnel that was built with Altman parts, and Altman did manufacture for other companies. Altman wasn't founded till 1953, so that would have been 10 years after Tesla's death. So a big I don't know if he did or not. But a good question. I like that.
I have no idea, although I'm looking into my crystal ball, and I do see the back of a lighting instrument that with the Westinghouse logo on it. And I don't know where it's coming from.
That sounds a bit familiar, almost like the Kliegel. I remember some old Kliegel Fresnels with like a K sort of like, not etched into it, but it was a hole, and the K was the solid part of the metal. Like it was an air vent with a K in it.
So was there one with a W in it? All right.
A W,
this is going to, whoever comes up with this image gets a free coffee mug. Okay.
Just don't put them in the dishwasher.
No, don't put them in the dishwasher. They are not dishwasher safe.
I've used, but mine's gone in the dishwasher. They did fine.
Well, that's because you don't use hot water in your dishwasher.
We do.
It's not hot enough, apparently.
We do.
Okay.
You are listening to Light Talk with the Lumen Brothers, and Light Talk is sponsored by
Wow Chemicals Delectable Designer's Flush. Everything was going great. The pandemic was over. My career was taken off. Directors were calling, asking me to light their shows, and my reviews were off the charts. But then suddenly, people started to avoid me. My colleagues would scatter like cockroaches when I approached the production table. Everyone disappeared suddenly for breaks, leaving me alone and sad in the theater. Worse, the calls for shows suddenly stopped. What happened? In desperation, I went to the doctor, and he told me about isolation breath syndrome. Apparently, this malady is the result of being socially isolated for months and letting your hygiene go to shit. Ultimately, this makes your breath so offensive that not only can it clear a theater in seconds, it can effectively fumigate a warehouse full of rodents and other small mammals. And brushing or mouthwash was totally ineffective. You see, toothpaste and mouthwash use antibacterial solutions. We are talking about a virus here. What I needed was a new nuclear-powered mouthwash. What I needed was Delectable Designer's Flush. Delectable Designer's Flush will kill all viral germs and leave your breath as clean as that old coffee decanter in the prop room. That's right. Delectable Designer's Flush was first developed by accident way back in the 1970s as a cleaning agent for theater prop scum. You know what I'm talking about. The chemicals that can dissolve the goo that theater artisans used to build props and clean lenses with. But don't worry, Wow Chemical has removed the toxic chemicals and substituted antiviral and old organic coffee grinds that safely flushes the funk away. So do what I did and try Delectable Designer's Flush to solve your isolation breath. If it does not work, then you have much bigger problems. For that, use Delectable Designer's Bidet Douche. Your popularity at the production table and your career will be restored.
And now, back to Light Talk.
Well, the sound of those rabid ducks tells us that once again it's time for our favorite segment, Let's Talk About. And today's Let's Talk About segment is all about, should teachers be responsible for social distancing and public health enforcement? So I'm going to kick this off to Stan because I know he has some very strong opinions about this.
Well, I don't exactly, except that it was on my radar this morning because we're getting asked questions about should we do this or should we do that? And what do you guys think about this? And could that work? And I'm like, man, you know, I have a big enough ego that I think I know a lot about a lot of things. but at some point, you know, at a certain point, you have to be humble and recognize where your own competencies are and where they are not. I mean, I don't have competency in this world. I have no training in it. As it is, I would say, faculty nowadays, not just in our higher education world, but across K through 12, are being asked to do things. I mean, even the police. I heard the New York Times has a podcast in the morning. They had the head of the Policemen's Benevolent Association, who kind of is like the union, and we had a very honest conversation. And he said, we are psychologists. Sometimes we're doctors. Sometimes they play so many roles.
That's the problem, though. Right. They're not experts in everything. And
right.
That's actually what a big thing about Black Lives Matter right now is talking about, is that instead of having the police do everything, have trained mental health people
for certain things.
For certain things. Right.
Well, I think
Makes sense.
Sometimes don't you think we play? I know that over the course of my career, I've had to play armchair psychologist, and
absolutely.
I don't. That's like I'm practicing something really important without a license. And now I'm asking to make decisions or have opinions about stuff about. It's not necessarily about social distancing. It's more about if you did a schedule, would this work? Or, like today, I offered my office up to create office space for grad students because in their offices now, to house all of them at one time, you could not maintain the guidelines. So there was a question about, well, could we, certain people have these spaces at this time and other people have spaces at this time. And one of my staff sent me pictures of my office today because he said, do you have any student records in your office? And I'm like, I don't think so. I have student work, like projects and stuff. And so now he sent me like 14 pictures of my office to jog my memory to decide whether or not I have student records that would be, too easily gotten to. So this
you don't remember if you have student records in your office?
Well, I don't think I do.
But you don't know for sure. There's students in there.
I don't think I do. Most student records, right, which is a different thing from student work. So I have binders full of projects that I use as examples. That's not student records, right? My computer is locked out, but is it possible that I've got something that in a drawer that shouldn't be there? I got to think about it. I'm not 100% certain.
So you could actually be violating someone's FERPA rights by accident.
But that's why they're asking me.
You brought this up, Stan, because I think it's a really good let's talk about subject. I was thinking about that they were talking about having faculty clean the classroom spaces after their classes. And I had a hard time with that, not because I don't like cleaning, but because I'm not an expert in antiviral cleaning. And then also it makes me liable if, in case, I didn't clean that classroom perfectly. And unfortunately, the poor student who comes in next time may be exposed. And what happens if that student gets exposed? They say, well, it's obviously comes from the classroom. That Yahoo before us, David, did not clean it adequately.
Well, let me say, in this conversation of using their office that could maximally hold under normal conditions 12 people, at one point the conversation was a question of, do we just assign people different locations or let it be a co-workspace, but then you could only be here these hours and you could be here these hours, but before you leave, you must clean your area. This is being discussed.
Crazy. I still believe that most universities are going to be shut down.
I'm with you on that, David, and I think they should be.
So want the university hire experts? They should do an actual site visit to every single teaching space at every classroom, because every classroom is different. HVAC systems are different in every classroom. The flow of the air is different. Have the experts make the decisions on where people should sit and stand.
I don't know. I think you guys are being all whiny. I remember the good old days. I remember the good old days when a teacher was a teacher and whatever came their way, they handled it. I remember Mrs. Sharp in the first grade. Not only did she teach me how to duck and cover, but after the nuclear attack was over, she took us outside and lined us up, and she walked us home that day to show us what she would do when the Ruskies dropped the bomb on us. Because probably, the roads would be messed up, cars wouldn't be there. But after we ducked and covered for 5 minutes, out the door, going to have you home for beans and wieners by 4 o'clock. So, she didn't say things like, where's my rubber suit or my hazmat? No, she lined us up, marched us down the road, oddly enough, with semis blasting down the road beside us. So I remember that vividly. And that happened probably through the 6th grade, the duck and cover period of my life.
At least on your way home, the beans and weenies would already be cooked. So you'd have no problem. Didn't have to open up the grill. They'd be grilled. So there you go.
Getting back to the topic, I think it's one thing for the university administration, for the president, the vice presidents, the provost, the guys in the suits to make decisions. But I think it's interesting that they're not making decisions with their faculty senate or representatives of the faculty. Rather, they're saying, well, I talked to old Stan K and he'll give his office up. No, I want the president of the University of Florida to say, Stan, I'm taking your office away from you. I want some higher ups to take some responsibility. Responsibility for what they're saying and what they're doing. How many times have you heard? And I've heard this, and sorry I'm going to hurt people's feelings in administration. Just hang on till January. If we can just get to January. Well, hang on. What scientific evidence are you basing this decision off that January is going to be better than July? So I want people who, this is what we pay them those big salaries for. Or at least have faculty involved.
Yeah.
And someone saying, this is what the anthropology department thinks. Maybe it's just the chairs show up.
I think you make some good points, Steve, and let me share something in that vein. So at UF, there's a very extensive, very long, very well thought out opening plan. And the union has its own task force. So I went to the union meeting the other day on Zoom, and there was about 60 people there. And I actually, David was proud of me because I opened my mouth. And a guy at the end said, well, the epidemiologists at UF have said in a webinar that I attended, they anticipate that 1/3 of the Gator Nation will be infected with COVID. And a gentleman asked at the end of that webinar a really salient question. He said, we have these reopening plans, but by what trigger or what measure will the university change its position and not open? By what? And the scientists said, we don't, that's not for us to decide. It's for the leadership. And the leadership has only mentioned 2 criteria. 1, the number of infections. And 2, the ability of the healthcare system in the city to handle the load, which gave a lot of people pause. So in the union meeting last week, a gentleman brought up the point. We see that we're all discussing the opening plan, but where's the closing plan? It doesn't exist. Where is the change your mind plan? By what methods do you do that? Like Steve is saying, by what scientific evidence? So I opened my mouth and I agreed, and I actually put on my lighting design hat. And I said, and most surprisingly, people understood what I was talking about. I said, if I'm looking at the play and I'm in page 5 and I'm writing the cue for page 5, I'm in the present. Now, I'm also aware of what happened on page 3. And there was a cue on page 3, which impacted sort of what I could do on page 5. And then I'm also thinking about page 7 and what I'm going to do on page 7, because what I do on page 5 is going to either give me freedom or restrictions about what I can do on page 7. So my head is in the present, the past, and the future all at the same time. And then I said, if I was doing a classic play, I might go back and look what a famous designer did on page 3 in the original production. I might not write the same cue, but I might say, that's a really beautiful cue. I see why they did that. Well, you can look at New York and Connecticut and say, there's a cue they wrote, and we see what the results of that cue was. I don't think I want to write that cue. And then I can look at Arizona and go, that's one ugly cue. I don't want to write that cue. And people sort of got that. So where is that kind of thinking? So my question is, why are you rolling the dice when we keep hearing we're going to have a vaccine by the end of the year, early next year? What is so imperative that we roll the dice now?
And Steve has our last listener question.
Okay, I have John in the UK, and John says, can I have too many light cues? My director looked at me last night and said, too many notes, Mozart.
Mozart.
Silence. Where's the silence? Where's the silence? Right.
I would always say, you get a tattoo and, put it in the palm of your hand. And it says, I don't get paid by the cue. Sometimes light cues can get in the way. They become so busy. Maybe you're chasing someone around the stage, and all we need is just something so we can make some decisions as an audience ourselves. So when your director says too many notes, Mr. Mozart, probably that's what he or she's referring to. It's a little too busy. It's a little too active, and it becomes a little bit distractive. We don't know where to look, or we're following your cues and we're missing something on the other side of the stage. So yes, I think you can have too many light cues in a show.
I have to agree. And my personal style is to have as few light cues as possible. And there is a reason for that. One is what Steve just said, but also because if you're not madly writing hundreds and hundreds of light cues, that means you can spend more time in the cues that you're writing. And that's really the key, is to be able to get the cues into the board and then have enough time as you're in run-throughs and dress rehearsals so that you can actually work on a cue. You don't have like 7 seconds to the next cue, Right. You want to be sitting in a cue for a while. Now, obviously, there are segments of shows where you can have cues right after each other. Absolutely. I knew this director once. I worked with her once, but my students worked with her a lot. And she was very heavy-handed with the lighting. And she actually had a lot of pretty good lighting insight, but her style was to overcue and overcue to death. In an opening production number, there'd be 100 cues in it.
Oh, my God.
In like 3 or 4 minutes. It was insane.
That's insane.
And the poor students could not deal with it. So I had to help them, and I had to talk to her, and we had to cut cues, and it was just a mishigosh. Well, the directors that I work with now, they follow my style, and because that's their style also. They like to be able to create an atmosphere and sit in it for a while. You know, I'm doing this workshop with a colleague of mine about score following on Thursday. It's really kind of interesting, teaching non-musicians how to follow a score. It's really aimed at lighting designers and stage managers. And we're doing a couple of cuts from Carousel. And I was looking at my score for Carousel that is about 40 years old, because I had designed it professionally somewhere 40 years ago. And there were 78 light cues in that for a major musical with major production numbers in it. Usually for a musical, I'll do 200, 300 light cues at the most. At the most. And that's just my style. That's just the way it is.
I am in agreement with you both, and I'll just add 2 fine little points. One, resist the temptation to do more. And I think I'll invoke an artist who, the longer you look at his work, the more alive and the more interesting it becomes, and that's Mark Rothko. So if you've never looked at Rothko, look at Rothko's work, because if David or Steve made a beautiful cue and it's really beautiful, the more you sit in it, and the more you refine it and the more you absorb it, you see more and more and more. But because people forget that lighting is a time art. And as you're looking at something, your eyes notices Rothko, oh, it's just an orange square and a blue square on a canvas. Looks so simple. Not true. It's layers and layers and layers of translucent paints. And you look at, because your brain just fills it in. Oh, it's a blue square and an orange square. But then you look at it, it comes alive. You have to sit there and give it time. So I say, take your time, make art. And sometimes, yeah, you need a lot. But generally speaking, focus.
You know, so there's something nice about simplicity also.
Yep,
Yeah.
there it is.
And cleanliness.
Yeah, you don't write cues because you can.
Right. You write it because they need to be there.
Exactly, because they need to be there.
Clearly, John thought they needed to be there.
Absolutely. And that's cool, because some people feel it needs to be there. That's what makes us all different artists. Well, the rocking sounds of the Luminoids tell us that once again you've spent another morning listening to Light Talk. You can hear our show on Spotify, iTunes, Google, and just about every podcast site out there. Check out our website on lighttalk.org for future guests, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and subscribe to our podcast. That way you will not miss a second of Light Talk fun.
No guarantee is offered regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on this podcast. However,
If you choose to litigate, the law firm of Fleck, Flock, Flare, and Glare and their paralegal snoot will defend us until our retirement funds are depleted.
Light Talk is written and produced by the Lumen Brothers, coming to you from Long Beach, Gainesville, and the Republic of Texas.
And be sure to tune in next week when we welcome back our friends Driscoll Otto and Zach Bovray to Light Talk.
All that and a new sponsor.
Light Talk, broadcasting questionable Lumen knowledge and humor around the world.
So we'll see you all again next Saturday morning. Stay healthy and stay happy. And bye-bye from Light Talk.
So long, everyone. Stay safe.
Light Talk. Lumen Brothers. Light Talk. Light Talk. Light Talk. Lumen Brothers. Light Talk.
Nice.